Alright, what's up guys? If you didn't already catch it, look back to the previous video for information on how I did the wiring diagram, how I did the setup, for some basics on motorcycle wiring and the components that I did on this bike. This video though, I'm going to get into the details of what type of wire, how I installed the wire, where the wire runs, do's and don'ts, and kind of break down the natural flow from power source to end unit component so that you can kind of see how it all works and build your own wiring diagram. So let's get into it. Alright, so first things first, I want to show you kind of the tools that I use and some of the products that I use, what I have left over. Again, wiring diagram, super critical. Have this done first. Know what you're going to do in advance before you start trying to wire your bike. So a couple things. As far as these wiring diagrams go, there are three primary circuit levels, as I say. Biggest circuit level is your primary power feed. So these are your battery cables. These are your big dogs. On my bike, it's this one right here that goes from the starter back to, you can see it on the battery terminals. That's bigger stuff. For that, this bike had 6 gauge already on it. So far that's worked completely fine for my needs. And so you'll probably see a lot of different take on that. Some people probably go even up to 4 gauge or something like that. To me, that's really thick. It's almost too thick to bother with. 6 gauge is nice. Still bends pretty easy. The fittings on the end are pretty easy to install. So 6 gauge for the main power feeds. The second power level, as far as I'm concerned, is the charging system and ignition system. And so ignition system, what I'm talking about there is any power that has to do with the points or the coil on the other side, and also the charging system, anything that has to do with ghetto driving by. So anything that has to do with the points or ignition system, or anything that has to do with the generator feeding back into the battery. For those circuits, I use 12 gauge. So this is a basic multi-strand. I don't know if you can see it in there. Let me see if I can focus. There you go. Multi-strand copper wire, 12 gauge. 12 gauge, the thicker stuff for all of that. I like that because it's got a little bit more capacity, a little more power opportunity. So beyond that, what's left is all of your minor circuits. So that would be any of the warning lights, it would be any of the switches, headlight, tail light, any of that small stuff. Now if you were running more accessories like speedometer and tach and turn signal, that would also be on this, what I'm considering a smaller circuit. For that, 16 gauge. A lot of guys will say, no, you got to use 14 everywhere, you got to use 12 everywhere. That's ridiculous. 16 is definitely big enough for these small loads. There is not a whole lot of amperage coming through these wires. 16 is perfectly fine. It's very flexible. I went online and found this 4-pack where you can get 50-foot rolls of 4 colors. So you're dealing with 200 feet of cable for like 18 bucks, free shipping. Super cheap. You can do multi-colors. You can set this up however you want with different colors for different circuits or high beams or low beams. You can try and match the original wiring diagram if you want, but I just found it helpful, especially if you're pulling wires through frame tubes, to have some sort of color combination so you know which one's pulling which. So again, primary, your battery and system, 6 gauge to me is fine. Anything dealing with ignition or coil, anything that touches that at all, 12 gauge. And then anything as far as lighting or accessories or warning lights, just drop it down to 16 and you'll be fine. Beyond that, the best investment I made was this little guy. No joking. Just go to Harbor Freight and ask them for the cheapest heat gun they have. I've tried to use hair dryers before, but 2 things I don't like about that. 1, my wife doesn't prefer it. And 2, this thing works a lot faster and a lot better. And I think it was like $12 from Harbor Freight, and if you use a coupon you can get it for less. Heat shrink tubing is, to me, really important. For one, it cleans up any wires that are exposed. For two, any wiring that actually goes through a frame rail, through a frame hole, you can actually backfeed. You can actually, for any wiring that goes through the frame hole, you can actually push in that shrink tubing further into the hole before you hit it with the heat. And even though you're not going to shrink the tubing that's all the way up in the frame rail, it'll still offer that little bit layer, another layer of protection on your wiring for any chafing. Speaking of chafing, when this frame was still raw before I went to powder, I was very careful to drill these holes and then grind down the outer lip and make it nice and round. It's kind of hard to see here, but all these edges I smoothed out. I was also concerned about the inside edge, how to get that smooth to make sure there was no chafing on the inside edge. For that, super simple, guys. Grab some of these bits here, just the little carbide cutters. I have one somewhere around here that's just a ball tip, which was actually even better because you can get inside and get in the hole and go around and actually cut down that inside edge. Just to grind it down, it's going to make it a lot smoother, because as you're pulling wires, to me that's where the biggest concern lies. Once the wires are in, there's not a whole lot going on. Yeah, you're going to get vibration, but for me, pulling the wires through, I didn't want to have to do all that and get everything set up, pull the wires through, and end up ripping off the sheathing off of all the wires. So make sure you prep your holes. Prep, and more prep. That makes life easy. So, speaking of the holes, here's the big thing to me. I wanted all this wiring in the frame, right? And you've probably seen videos or seen reports or read online how to do this, but I want to reinforce it because everything I saw online was very clear in this regard. All you have to do is run pull wires first before you actually try and string your cabling. So I had some leftover of that thicker, I don't know where I tossed it. This thicker 12 gauge stuff was really good for pushing through the frame rails to run as pull wires. I think I used black just because I had a whole bunch of it left over. So for instance, let's say I'm trying to run these wires here from here up and down. The way I did that was I took a pull wire, measured out for this length and cut it about an extra foot or two each direction, fed it up through. And this was not easy, but it wasn't terribly difficult. I actually think on this one I fed it down through. I fed it down through and fished it out of this hole, and then I had one cable that was hanging out here and hanging out here. But then what I also did was fed another cable from there, from this top hole, down the front frame rail to this hole. And so when the time came, I had a pull wire that was going from here to here with a whip on each end. From this end, I taped together this 16 gauge wire for the oil pressure switch. I taped it down here and started pulling it up through the hole. I'm pulling out the top, right? When I get to the top, well, that's great. The oil pressure cable is here, but if you notice on the diagram, that line has to go up here and not out that hole, but then back down this way. So once it was out this top hole, then you just connect the oil pressure line and do the same thing with the generator line. You connect both of those to this wad of headlight cables and pull the whole batch through this leg. So don't try and do a pull wire from this hole all the way down to this hole just because you need your oil pressure switch run that far. Go from hole to hole, connect the dots, hole to hole. Every short distance of hole to hole should have a pull wire in it with a big old fat whip on each end. I mean, it gets to be a pretty big spaghetti mess of wires hanging all over the place. And especially because there's going to be different colors, and there's going to be some black for pull wires and some black that are actually ground, and it gets to be a real tricky thing. Hey, I can see my reflection. That's kind of weird. Which is why, as the wires get more of a mess, it's so critical to have this. And in fact, I had one of these diagrams printed out in color so I could actually see what color cables the wires were supposed to be, everywhere. It's so key because you're going to come back to this a million times. I had like 3 or 4 of these things printed out, and all of them had all kinds of markings and everything done up. This one was actually my last one that I printed out right before I went to powder coat to make sure that all my holes were drilled properly. And so diagram, prep, plan, measure 75 times, install wiring once. You get the idea. So use pull wires and just be logical about it. Go step by step, and before you know it, what you'll end up having is a frame that's fully done up with all your wires in the frame tubes with all these whips hanging out the end. That's exactly what you want. And if possible, do that when the frame is bare. If you had your motor out, great. That's a perfect time to wire, because you're going to want to move this frame around. We had it upside down and inside out. My 10-year-old daughter was helping me wire. She actually did most of the wire pulling herself. And so if anybody tells you that pulling wiring is too hard, I just want you to know my 10-year-old daughter wired most of my bike. So challenge. So I know I said I was going to get in this video onto the whole breakdown of connecting and what the power is and how it all works and how it all flows from one thing to another. I didn't get there. I want to keep the videos somewhat manageable in length. So stay tuned. Part 3 is now coming your way. So if you don't see the link pop up right here in one of the description boxes or something, just go to the YouTube channel, look down through the list, and you'll see parts 1, 2, and 3. If you missed part 1, go back and check that out first so you know what we're talking about. If you've seen parts 1 and this part 2, awesome, good on you. Go check out part 3. Thanks guys for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. I do my best to answer all the questions, all the comments in the videos. So thanks for watching, and see you in part 3.